Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Lewis, scholar in residence at the Filson. Thank you for joining us for this virtual lecture. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Richard H.C. Clay. Dick is the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. He is a graduate of Davidson College, where he received a bachelor's in economics, attended Yale University Divinity School under the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation Fellowship, and received his JD from the University of Kentucky College of Law. During his tenure at UK, he was the managing editor of the Kentucky Law Journal. In addition to his passion for history and education, Dick's professional career spans more than 40 years. Prior to coming to the Filson, he was a partner with Dinsmore and Scholl, LLP. In addition to his career as a lawyer, he served on the board of the Cabbage Patch Settlement House, the Presbyterian Church USA Foundation, Kentucky Country Day School, and served as board chair as a trustee of the Speed Art Museum. He now serves as chair of the advisory board of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Art. It's my pleasure to turn over today's proceedings to Dick.
I want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching this today. I want to thank you for all the communications that you sent to me while I had COVID-19 and was in the hospital for about 3 weeks. Those notes, texts, calls really sustained me, and I'm profoundly, utterly grateful to you. Then on behalf of the Filson, I would like to thank you too for your support of our programs during this time of pandemic, for your memberships, and for your support of our annual fund, all of which matter so much to us. They're our lifeblood. Thank you. Then I would like to talk to you very briefly about Madison Johnson. At the outset, I want to say that he died in 1886. That's 134 years ago. And that time lapse and the era that we're now in frequently does not reflect well on white slaveholding individuals back up to the time before and leading up to the Civil War. Johnson was, as you'll learn today, an emancipationist, and he was guided by a lodestar, and that lodestar was to preserve the Union at all costs. And in his support of the pro-Union government in ostensibly neutral Kentucky, and in other things that he did, he made an enormous difference over time. So with that aside, this talk in some ways picks up where Patrick Lewis ended in his remarkable talk on emancipation on Juneteenth. I'm going to focus on Madison Johnson, a white slaveholding Lexington, Kentucky lawyer and banker, who again, as I said, was dedicated to the preservation of the Union. The call 5 years ago came from one of Lexington's most knowledgeable antique dealers. Would I be interested in a portrait by Oliver Fraser of one of Kentucky's most significant lawyers, Madison Johnson, who, by the way, had been married to a cousin of mine? I told him that my branch of the Clay family was from Henderson, not the aristocratic bluegrass, and that we were second cousin relations who posed for photographs, not portraits. Plus, to be honest, at that point, I'd never heard of Madison Johnson. Nevertheless, I looked at the portrait, was intrigued by it, said I'd buy it, changed my mind, obsessed about it for a week, called him back and said I'd pick it up with a check. That started a 5-year immersion into his life and times. His obelisk stands in the Lexington Cemetery. And the enchanting house he built has been beautifully restored. Yet 134 years after his death in 1886, Madison Conyers Johnson is virtually unknown. The little that has been written about him in recent years is in connection with his house, Botherham. He is frequently described as an eccentric widower who built the house as a monument to his wife, who died less than a year after their marriage in 1828. His portrait, painted by his close friend Oliver Fraser, shows a young, aristocratic, highly intelligent Lexington lawyer and emerging civic power. The briefs he wrote, many of which are contained in the over 120 published cases he handled, are models of clarity, devoid of unnecessary prose, intellectually adroit and dispassionate, written by a skilled appellate lawyer speaking to judges on an appellate bench as peer-to-peer, intellect to intellect. His one-story home, while not grand, is elegant and restrained, constructed out of limestone with an unusual combination of Gothic and Greek Revival elements. Johnson's life and career deserve to be revived. Born in Scott County in 1806, he became the quintessential Kentucky intellectual during a period when Lexington was at its height as the Athens of the West. Through a period of decline due largely to its inland location, the advent of the railroads, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and post-Reconstruction. The spirit of Athenian enlightenment remained with him throughout his professional lifespan. As a law professor at his alma mater, Transylvania University, he taught John Marshall Harlan, destined for greatness on the United States Supreme Court as the great dissenter, for his ringing dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson. No greater lawyer, remarked Harlan, in the largest sense of the word, ever lived in this country, in my judgment, than Madison C. Johnson. He deserves to be ranked by the side of Delia Webster, Rufus Choate, and lawyers of that kind. After the death of Johnson's father, his mother married John Allen, a wealthy landowner in Fayette County. Johnson was very close to his stepfather and his step and half-brothers, and is buried in the Lexington Cemetery with members of the Allen family. His step-nephew, the Kentucky author James Lane Allen, wrote the novel Two Gentlemen of Kentucky, in which the aging, privileged, white, post-war protagonist is modeled on his Uncle Matt. Johnson was active in literary societies in Lexington and Frankfort. He was fascinated by science, astronomy, agriculture, and horticulture. He trained a cadre of younger lawyers who went on to great distinction, one of whom, John Mason Brown, was one of the 10 original founders of the Filson Historical Society. Johnson was a key part of Lexington's, and for that matter, Kentucky's power structure until his death. His emblematic value to people now living in Kentucky and the Ohio River Valley region is a portrait of a liberally educated man to whom intellectual freedom was paramount will be manifest. Johnson's almost willfully invisible leadership, his ethics, family, and civic loyalty, judgment and taste, all define him. He consolidated and preserved power by meticulously building his law practice, his bank, and his civic commitments. He clearly thrived on being indispensable, but in rather a hidden way. His grandparents, Robert and Jemima Suggett Johnson, were among the earliest Kentucky settlers, first at Bryan's Station and then at their own, Johnson Station at Great Crossings in Scott County. They're buried in the family cemetery at Great Crossings. The grave site is covered in weeds, and the tumbled markers are barely discernible. Colonel Johnson was a monumental figure in Kentucky statehood efforts. He accumulated great wealth in surveying, land speculation, farming, banking, and transportation. Along with General Greenclay of Madison County, he became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the Commonwealth. Further adding to his prominence, Johnson became one of the earliest trustees of Transylvania University. According to legend, the redoubtable Jemima led a band of women down to the spring outside Bryan Station for a supply of water to extinguish Indian flames, knowing that an ambush was planned. Robert and Jemima produced 11 children. The second son, William, was Madison's father. He was born in Virginia in 1775 and married Betsy Payne of Scott County's Payne Station in 1801. And he died in Scott County in 1814, 7.5 years after his son Madison was born. William and Betsy had 6 sons, the second of whom was Matt. William Johnson served under General Green Clay in the War of 1812 by commanding a battalion of the Kentucky militia. Matt Johnson left no written records about his lineage, although it certainly was well known, and he would have carried it with him as part of his framework, his mindset, who he was. Yet there was one famous family member, one of his uncles, who may have been a concern and more than likely an embarrassment. Richard Mentor Johnson, the 5th child and 3rd son of Robert and Jemima. He was the hero of the War of 1812's Battle of the Thames, who allegedly, reputedly, perhaps, had killed the Shawnee warrior Tecumseh. He also was the principal founder of the Choctaw Indian Academy in Scott County. Armed with outwardly the purest of motives, Johnson made money off the academy and its students during the years it was open on his land. More significantly, for a longer-term investment, members of the Johnson and related Ward families acquired vast tracts of fertile Arkansas and Mississippi farmland due to the displacement of the Choctaws. Richard Mentor Johnson served one term as Vice President of the United States from 1836 to 1840 under President Martin Van Buren, a Democrat from New York who, like Johnson, was aligned with Andrew Jackson. Perhaps most shocking to antebellum society, he had a common law wife, a woman of mixed race named Julia Chin. She was raised in slavery on the Scott County farm by Richard Mentor's mother, Jemima. Johnson was dropped by Van Buren from the Democratic ticket in 1840, in part due to criticism of this common law marriage, his 2 daughters from that marriage, and his mixed race sexual relationships with other women enslaved by him. One can only imagine the effect of Uncle Richard on the seemingly straight-laced Matt, who was in his early 30s during Uncle Richard's vice presidency. No correspondence between the two has thus far been located, and what emerges is a studied silence on the part of the nephew, who would have been well aware of his uncle's lifestyle, high debt level, and financial maneuverings. There was one thing they did have in common. Both were self-professed emancipationists, although Madison was by far the more real. Madison Johnson graduated from the family alma mater, Transylvania University, at age 16. He graduated first in his class of 33 in 1823. The legend is that he was considered by the president, Dr. Horace Holly, to be physically unattractive, so much so that Holly refused to let the young valedictorian present the graduation address. Johnson remained at Transylvania for 2 additional years in its law school and received his LLB in 1825. Dr. Holly became the leader of intellectual enlightenment in Lexington at the time. Over his 9-year tenure from 1818 to 1827, he transformed Transylvania from a small college to a nationally recognized university. The Unitarian Holly, however, came under attack by strict Presbyterians for theological liberalism, an overfondness for worldly amusements, and an unfounded opinion that he was causing Transylvania somehow to decline. At the height of the attacks on Dr. Holly, which were vicious, the graduates of the class of 1821, probably led by Matt Johnson, wrote an open letter published in a Lexington newspaper to the people of Kentucky that was dated January 19th, 1824, in which they defended Holly, particularly with reference to the exercise of his freedom of religion. This is the earliest indication of Johnson's intellectual and moral independence in the exercise of thought and religion. Madison was 22 years old when he married Sally Ann Clay Irvine, the daughter of General Green Clay and the widow of Edmund H. Irvine. They were second cousins through the maternal side. This is another illustration of the connectedness of the bluegrass planter class. Sally Ann's marriage to the swashbuckling 24-year-old Edmund Irvine, in which Johnson himself had served as a witness, ended after 1 month of marriage. Irvine was the scion of another prominent family in the Richmond, Kentucky area. Irvine was shot to death on December 16, 1822, by the editor of the Richmond Republican newspaper, after going to the editor's office with a bullwhip, claiming that he'd been defamed by the editor. After Irvine's death, Sally Ann appears to have retreated to her father's home, Claremont, in Madison County. And as you look there at the picture, the little protuberance at the front with the two, it looks like little columns on the side, is the original Claremont. And then the magnificent Italianate Whitehall mansion is what is behind that. Green Clay's wealth came from distilleries, a tavern, ferry operations across the Kentucky River, and extensive land holdings. He also owned significant numbers of enslaved human beings. Green Clay died on October 31st, 1828. Madison and Sally Ann married a few months later on December 23rd, 1828. There are no records as to the cause of her death on October 13th, 1829. The cholera epidemic did not hit central Kentucky until 1833. So it seems possible that she died in childbirth, given the 10-month interval between her marriage to Madison and her death. Sally Ann is buried in her father's family cemetery on a rise roughly a mile away and with a clear view of the Claremont Whitehall mansion. Like the Johnson Cemetery at Great Crossings, it is a mess of tumbled stones. There you can see the marker of Sally Ann. It was covered with mud and emerging grass last March when I was there to look for it, and I scraped the mud off and was able to get that picture. At its essentials, this was a union between the two most important families within the spokes of the early antebellum Lexington wheel, the Clays and the Johnsons. Representing land, both. Transportation, the Johnsons had a turnpike from Scott County to Warsaw on the Ohio, and stagecoaches as well. And the Clays had ferries across the Kentucky River. Banking, the Johnsons, and distilleries, the Clays. Ownership of enslaved human beings, sadly, both. Immense land holdings in and out of Kentucky, south of the Tennessee River, the Clays, and Arkansas and Mississippi, the Johnsons. And immense political influence, both. There are mysterious and unanswerable questions arising from a marriage that took place almost 200 years ago, trapped behind the opaque wall of achievement and veiled power that Madison Johnson constructed around himself. Was this a love match? Was this marriage arranged? Did Sally Ann die in childbirth? Did he mourn her the rest of his long life? Why did he never remarry? Was he so psychologically devastated by her death and possibly that of a child that he self-protected through a capacity for work and attention to detail, making these attributes fixed in his character for the rest of his life. The unanswerable questions themselves connote his hidden nature. Johnson initially defined himself as a Democrat. This seems only natural given the fact of his family's Madisonian connections. He cast his first vote for Andrew Jackson. Ultimately, however, he became a member of the Whig Party, given the fact that the Lexington economic, social, and political circles in which he moved were dominated by Henry Clay. Johnson's close ties to Clay lasted until Clay's death in 1852. He remained a Whig until the party's dissolution, at which time he became a constitutional unionist and voted for John Bell. During the Civil War, he supported Lincoln to the hilt, and then following the war, he did return to the Democratic Party. In early 1849, Governor Crittenden appointed Johnson as Attorney General of Kentucky. Johnson resigned at the end of 1849 as Crittenden headed to the United States Senate. In anticipation of a constitutional convention to address, among other things, questions concerning slavery and emancipation, a series of emancipation meetings were held all over the state, attended by people who supported emancipation, either in a strict or moderate form, or in the form of colonization in Africa as advocated by Henry Clay. The largest statewide emancipation convention was held in Frankfort on April 25th, 1849. A platform opposed to the continuance of slavery was adopted, but no workable plan for emancipation was achieved. Johnson had been selected as a delegate. However, he was not listed among those who actually attended, perhaps because his service as Attorney General at the time would have demanded his neutrality, or perhaps because his attendance simply was not recorded. Testifying in essence as an expert in an 1866 deposition, he made clear that he had been an emancipationist all of his life and voted in the direction of a constitutional emancipation provision in 1849. Johnson was not a delegate to the 1849-1850 Kentucky Constitutional Convention, which wrote vastly more protective measures for slaveholders into the Constitution of 1850. Probably knowing where the votes were, that is something that Johnson wanted nothing to do with. In 1850, Johnson and James Harlan, John Marshall Harlan's father, were appointed by the General Assembly to prepare a code of practice in civil and criminal cases. A combined civil and criminal code with forms and amendments was adopted in 1854. This was a hugely impressive undertaking, giving judges and practitioners clear, written practice guidelines and forms. These guidelines, written by careful and experienced litigators, are the precursors of the modern-day Kentucky rules of civil and criminal procedure. It was also an important and intellectually demanding assignment that recognized his abilities and commanded the respect of his peers. The cases handled by Johnson during the antebellum years 1835 to 1857, as threats to the Union and war clouds arose, demonstrate a steadily growing and ultimately formidable civil litigation practice dealing with testamentary disputes, leases, titles, defense of shareholder rights, effects of promissory notes, and public nuisances. A great deal of Johnson's legal work during this period reflected the commerce of the times, some of which involved the property rights of slaveholders. These cases collectively dispel any thought that Johnson was an abolitionist or a strict emancipationist. although they don't preclude him from being a gradual emancipationist. His legal work for clients clearly was about the assertion and enforcement of property rights, some of which in the earliest years of his practice arose from slavery. This also dispels the notion and kind of the public view that was put forth over the years that Johnson was a secret abolitionist and that Botherham was a station on the Underground Railroad. Everything I've discovered has indicated probably not, although I think you'll soon be able to see why people may have thought that. One of Johnson's most high-profile and unusual cases was his defense of the Matahari of the Underground Railroad, Delia Webster. She'd been caught, along with her compatriot, the Reverend Calvin Fairbank, for spiriting an enslaved couple, the Haydens, out of Lexington and across the Ohio River for freedom. Even though she was ultimately convicted, the jury wrote a unanimous letter following her conviction to Governor William Owsley requesting a pardon, which he ultimately gave. He didn't give one, and the jury didn't request for Reverend Fairbank. Why would Johnson, whose practice centered on the property rights sometimes of slaveholders, have undertaken the defense of Delia Webster? One suspects that Johnson took the case out of compassion for the sheer intellectually and emotionally absorbing effort necessary for her defense. To use his defense, however, as an indication that he was in sympathy with the abolitionist movement must be considered unsupportable, at least by the extant facts. Johnson's professional and public identity was as much wrapped up with the Northern Bank of Kentucky as it was in the practice of law. While law gave him intellectual satisfaction, the Northern Bank provided a power base from which he could make loans, influence politicians, and spur public improvements. The Northern Bank was chartered by the Kentucky General Assembly in 1835, and Johnson, who was only 29, was added as a state-appointed director, the start of a power base that expanded when he became president of the bank in 1858, lasting shortly before his death in 1886. This was a time in Kentucky's banking history when banks were allowed to have out-of-city or out-of-county branches. And they were ultimately established or expanded in Richmond, Paris, Louisville, Covington, Barberville, and Glasgow. Throughout its history, the bank operated in the same building depicted there in the picture, formerly the Bank of the United States branch, on the corner of Short and Market Streets in Lexington. Johnson owned 7 to 11 slaves throughout the antebellum period through the Civil War. They appear to have been inherited from his parents and one who was ultimately freed from Sally Ann. Like many of his Whig political friends who held slaves, Johnson sought gradual emancipation. His own enlightened spirit and education and his desire to preserve the Union determined his consistently pro-Union stance. According to the U.S. Census of 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, Madison Johnson was the owner of 11 slaves. Looking back a year after the war, he stated that he'd always favored emancipation and voted for it in 1849. Given Johnson's ownership of slaves all the way up to the eve of the war, as I've said, there's no credible evidence that he allowed Botherham to be a station for the Underground Railroad, contrary to the legend. Nor is there any evidence that he was an ardent abolitionist, despite his close ties to Sally Ann's brother, Cassius Marcellus Clay. There is, however, ample evidence that he was sympathetic to emancipation, And in an 1866 affidavit, he testified that he'd helped certain African Americans purchase their freedom. I think the bottom line for Johnson was that rather than be an abolitionist and risk seeing Kentucky dive into the Confederacy, he chose to take a more moderate path as an emancipationist, although a gradual one, in order to keep Kentucky neutral and in order to help preserve the Union. 134 years later, it perhaps does not seem like the brilliant, wonderful, noble cause that one would have wished for him. And yet there is an authenticity when one considers that his lodestar at all times was preservation of the Union. Among his greatest civic achievements was the creation of the Lexington Cemetery in 1849. Johnson was one of the original members of the cemetery's board. He served as board president from March 1867 until his death in 1886. He also was actively engaged in the Lexington Public Library and the Lexington Lunatic Asylum as a trustee for many years. He also served on the board of the school founded by his friend David A. Sayre, which at that time was known as the Sayre Female Institute and now is known as the Sayre School. His chief service to Lexington and to the state was as chair for many years of Transylvania's board. These civic activities are those of a man not particularly anxious to be like a politician in the public eye. He simply utilized his connections, time, talent, and personal funds for the public good. Johnson had a number of deep friendships that spanned his youth, professional and civic life, and intellectual interests. Two of the most compelling were with the artist Oliver Fraser, who painted his portrait and that of Sally Ann, and with Eliza Brand McAllister Woodward, with whom Madison had a long and enduring friendship that may have bordered on an older age romance. Eliza married Edward McAllister, a Philadelphian who moved to Kentucky and ultimately entered her father's hemp bagging and rope business. Pendant miniatures of them by John W. Dodge in 1843 in the collection of our neighbor, the Speed Art Museum, depict a young, attractive couple in their early 30s. She appears quite intelligent, with penetrating dark eyes and long, dark, stylishly curled hair. Later accounts of her as an older woman by her relatives reflect a very bright, philanthropic, well-traveled, and quite directional human being. These qualities are shown in a full-length portrait of her hanging at Christ Church Cathedral in Lexington. In a letter written to his brother, William H. Johnson, Madison made this reference to the widowed Eliza's 57-year-old charms. I don't remember whether I've answered an inquiry made in one of your letters about the appearance of Mrs. McAllister. I believe it was Lucy who made the inquiry. Say to her that to her or your eyes, Mrs. McAllister would simply appear the freshest and best preserved woman of her age she ever saw. But to my eyes, she looks just as she did in her maiden days, a thing that changes not, or rather as some pure and generous wind on which time and years has no other effect than to temper, soften, and improve. Other than this tribute, there is no indication of a romantic relationship. Indeed, Eliza went on to marry a second husband, a Philadelphian, and Madison witnessed that marriage as well, who died several years later. In one of his will's few specific bequests, Madison left Eliza his large diamond stud. Around 1844, Johnson bought land fronting Town Fork of Elkhorn River on the Versailles Turnpike. It's now West High Street in Lexington, up near Rupp Arena. The house he built on this tract was completed in 1851. Johnson named the house, designed and built by the architect John McMurtry, Botherham. Clearly, Johnson obtained the name from a lengthy poem by the English satirist John Anstey about a legal case between the lawyer Botherham and the lawyer Borum. The house was primarily constructed out of limestone and is a much heralded combination of Greek and Gothic revival styles. The house, which actually could be labeled a cottage with 20-foot high ceilings, was originally shaped like a U, with an iron staircase within the open court of the U leading up and over the roof to an octagonal turret. If you, Patrick, could switch to the next slide, I think they may be able to see it. This provided Johnson, an amateur astronomer, with a platform for stargazing. The house has been sensitively restored by the landscape architect John Karloftis and has been written about extensively. It is regarded as one of the high points of Kentucky architectural style and is considered to be a national example of a blend of Greek and Gothic revival in a cottage style. Also on the property were servants' houses and greenhouses placed on either side of the creek running from Patterson Spring. An enormous ginkgo tree near the house that is thought to have been a gift from Henry Clay still stands. Given his work at the Lexington Cemetery and his Botherham greenhouses, Johnson clearly was a horticulturalist. In a sense, Botherham is a temple built by a man who created his own private, self-contained kingdom. It reflects his architectural, horticultural, mechanical, scientific, and literary passions. By the sheer location of the large tract, at that time, he was able to look down on Lexington and across the horizon to the Lexington Cemetery. Johnson was hidden away from public view, but fully capable of observing. And this is one reason why Union troops were harbored at Botherham on the grounds during the Civil War. Johnson allowed that to take place. The crux of Madison Johnson's unconventional career in Kentucky politics and business was the conflict over slavery and the Civil War. In this, he was like every Kentucky man, or most Kentucky men who held slaves of his generation. Yet his path through the tangled worlds of slavery, secession, and Civil War were unlike some of his closest antebellum family members and friends, most notably his brother, George Washington Johnson, and another friend and family member, John C. Breckinridge. Not only were his politics different, but the behind-the-scenes power brokering style that he'd adopted for himself meant that he wielded power differently than those men. By 1859, Johnson was firmly entrenched as president of the well-capitalized Northern Bank of Kentucky. He was well-positioned for quiet, effective, behind-the-scenes leadership of Lexington during the war years. In the end, he skillfully navigated his position on the fault lines of Kentucky's divided political establishment and managed to sustain his position when others met with political and financial disaster after the war. Johnson sought a compromise that would protect the Union. With the death of Henry Clay in 1852, Kentucky's Whig Party fell. Johnson urged his friend, Senator John J. Crittenden, that a new party be created with a platform designed to avoid any sectional issues, reject any know-nothing party prejudice to Catholics, and express strong unionist feelings, but a cautious non-intervention concerning the problem of slavery in the Western territories. Johnson also suggested a name for this new group, the National Union Party, as this would avoid all the stigmas and prejudices raised by the names Whig, or American Know Nothing. And the party did become, this idea of his did become ultimately the Constitutional Union Party. And while Senator Crittenden declined to run as its candidate, John Bell did. Johnson's first test after Abraham Lincoln's election came on August 21st, 1861. This is one of the few times the hidden Johnson went public. Kentucky was officially neutral at the time, but individuals on both sides, pro-Unionists and pro-slavery, were arming themselves. The Unionists called for arms in order to prevent the state from being taken out of the Union. President Lincoln directed an initial secret consignment of 5,000 guns to be distributed to pro-Unionists in Kentucky. Johnson, members of the Speed family, and others were among the leaders of the efforts to distribute the guns. The consignment was taken by rail from Cincinnati, ultimately to Louisville, and then taken to Lexington, where Southern sympathizers laid plans to seize them. A bloody outbreak was averted only through the efforts of John C. Breckinridge, who had resigned as vice president and gone back to Lexington before moving on over to the Confederacy, and Johnson, in which they both urged the crowd away from violence and literally stopped a fight for the guns, making those guns available as a result to the Union. Johnson underwent enormous tension within his immediate family in the personage of his younger, priggish brother, George Washington Johnson, who became decidedly secessionist in his views. A Confederate shadow government was established in Bowling Green, and George Washington Johnson was elected governor of this new so-called Confederate state. Kentucky's ill-starred shadow government was admitted to the Confederacy on December 10, 1861. His governorship was largely unsuccessful and short-lived given monetary difficulties. George Johnson soon resigned his governorship and entered the Confederate Army as a volunteer aide in the Battle of Shiloh, where he was killed on the battlefield. Friends in the Union Army, including John Marshall Harlan, packed his body in salt and shipped it to Louisville, then on to Georgetown for burial. George was firmly convinced of the justice of the Confederate cause, and he buttressed his political views with strongly held religious beliefs on the righteousness of the cause and biblical justifications for slavery. In other words, he was the polar opposite of his open-minded, analytical, outwardly unemotional Unionist brother. There was a serious financially based disagreement between the two brothers. One is in his capacity as Confederate governor, and the other in his capacity as president of Kentucky's largest bank, but a disagreement on which George ultimately gave ground. The shadow Confederate State Council, led by George, directed him to confiscate all the assets of the Northern Bank's Glasgow branch and remove them to Bowling Green. Suit was threatened by the Northern Bank against George Johnson and other members of his government. While he considered this harassment, he ultimately gave ground and the confiscated funds were fully restored according to the balance books of the Northern Bank within 6 months. 2 months later, George was dead. In a sense, his legal cases gave Madison Johnson the freedom to argue any given side of a matter, depending on the client's needs, just as mine over a 40-year span gave me that freedom. His banking interest did not allow the same freedom. He walked a fine line between being a lifelong advocate of emancipation and a Unionist, while remaining a Democrat in post-war Kentucky, where sympathy with the lost cause was growing rapidly, due to the perceived excesses of Reconstruction and in neighboring states, the Freedmen's Bureau. The most salient example of this tension arose in 1866, when Johnson gave an affidavit in an investigation by the Kentucky General Assembly into an allegedly defamatory and incendiary speech against the Commonwealth by the assistant head of the Kentucky Freedmen's Bureau, Brevet Major General Clinton B. Fisk. And in an aside, Clinton Fisk is the hero who gave a large sum of money at the time, I think it was $30,000, to a struggling Black institution in Nashville, which became known and is still known as Fisk University. In a speech in Cincinnati, Fisk alleged mistreatment of certain African-American soldiers in Lexington. Johnson denied any such maltreatment, stating that if any had occurred, he and others would have known of it. To bolster his credentials, he stated, "I have all my life been in favor of emancipating the slaves of the state. I voted in that direction when the question was before the people in 1849 and have never changed my opinion on the subject. The freed persons in Lexington have always shown great confidence in me and have been long in the habit of applying to me for advice and assistance. I have repeatedly assisted certain slaves in paying for themselves in order to set them free. I am now, and have been for some years, president of the Northern Bank of Kentucky." Johnson, in essence, allowed himself to be used as an expert witness for the Commonwealth. He would typically not have involved himself in such a public dispute. The Northern Bank of Kentucky had made two $500,000 loans, a huge amount for the time, to the Commonwealth and would have been awaiting payment. Most assuredly, the Northern Bank, as the state's largest and most solvent bank, would have wanted to make more loans to Kentucky during the post-war period. This would have been a way for Johnson at a critical time to continue the Northern's close banking relationship with Kentucky's government, by that time more identifying with this so-called lost cause. It was also a way for him to make Kentucky appear forward-thinking in its treatment of African Americans in order to be attractive to out-of-state investors. So he was straddling a line. The Civil War triggered a 4,000% increase in the national debt. The Union cause had been largely underwritten by the issuance of long-term bonds and greenbacks to finance the war. Greenbacks are pieces of paper backed neither by silver nor by gold. The nation underwent a financial panic in 1873, the effects of which lasted until 1877. The Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes, is credited with getting the nation's finances back in a stable condition. Johnson was one of several advisors to the Hayes Treasury Department on how to achieve financial stability through the introduction of a choice to bondholders to get repaid at the fixed amount or receive new higher yielding bonds backed by gold and silver. Most astute investors opted for the latter. In an interview given during the last year of his life, Johnson laughingly stated, "It is perhaps a little peculiar for a Democrat to help a Republican administration out of its mire, but it was at least patriotic." Madison Johnson died at 10 minutes to 12 a.m. on December 7th, 1886. The outpouring of affection for Johnson at his funeral attracted statewide attention. A young great-niece, Anne Payne Kaufman, attended his funeral in Lexington's Christ Church Cathedral with her mother. In Ms. Kaufman's words, "When I was 15 or 16, I attended Uncle Matt's funeral in Lexington. 2 pews ahead of us sat a beautiful woman with snow-white hair, eerily lighted by the rays from a stained glass window. That's Mrs. McAllister, whom Uncle Matt has been in love with for many years," my mother whispered. Thwarted by the premature death of Sally Ann, the possible death of a child, and a long friendship that did not result in marriage, but clearly with an enormous capacity for love, Matt Johnson immersed himself in the practice of law, finance and banking, his civic and philanthropic life, his intellectual interests, his masterpiece of a house, his friends, and his extended family. He was an emancipationist, although a gradual one, and he was always firmly devoted to the preservation of the Union. He employed his immense intellectual and financial power for the betterment of his professions, law and banking, the improvement of his city, the protection of his state, and above all, the preservation of the Union. Perhaps the best summation of Johnson's character is in the Latin phrase from Seneca on his book plates, si vis amare ama, to be loved, love. Thank you. Oh, I would like to show you something before we go to questions. A couple of months ago, I was in Lexington, and I stopped by the house on North Limestone, or Broadway, excuse me, known as Rose Hill. It was the home built by Eli Brand, the father of Eliza Brand McAllister. I have to admit, unwisely peeking in the windows, but the current owner very thoughtfully let me come in once I explained what I was doing and look around. And as I was leaving, he handed me this. It's a copper plate with Madison Johnson's picture on it, engraved, as you'll see. And on the back, I don't know if you can see it or not, it says Madison Johnson. The owner had no idea how this came to be there, but we do know that Johnson gave pictures to family and friends, and at that point, members of the Brand family would have been still living in the house and undoubtedly had one of these. And so it's possible that this great gift, which I'll ultimately leave, I think, with the Filson, was just somehow stayed in the house, either in a closet or the basement or somewhere. It's kind of a neat little thing that has some meaning to me, having really, as my family will tell you all, spent the last 5 years of my life with MCJ, as I frequently call him. Questions?
Well, thanks so much, Dick. And as a Transy alum, I was glad to see it featured so much in the talk. And I absolutely love Rose Hill being right around the corner. It's my favorite Lexington houses. Somebody asked if you could hold the plate up a little bit higher so we could get a better look at it. The engraving.
Gladly.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Oh yeah, that caught good light. I think that, and that's the one from the engraving that we showed so much.
That's right. It's the same. Yeah. It's the same picture. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then on the back someone had written the name Madison Johnson in pencil. I don't know when. Maybe that's better.
Yeah, got it. We had a few genealogical questions. One is Madison Conyers Johnson's tombstone within the family plot on his property?
That's very interesting. The answer is no. Johnson is buried at the Lexington Cemetery. He is buried right around the corner from Eliza Brand McAllister. James Lane Allen is buried about 2 graves down in what I'll call the Madison Johnson Allen family plot. Johnson's mother and her second husband are buried near Madison at the Lexington Cemetery. along with his brother, I think it's William, who is buried there with Madison. So you've got an interesting blend of Johnsons and Allens, and then the Brands are right next door, and you can see Henry Clay's monument just right down the way. And by the way, Johnson was one of the conscriptors of the Clay monument, and he also, Clay's will was holographic, that is, Clay wrote it, and Johnson attested that it was Clay's handwriting and signature. And then when Clay's body was to be brought back from Washington to Lexington, Johnson went up to Washington and was among the group that brought the body back.
A couple of other connections questions. Is there a known connection between Johnson and Alexander Campbell?
That I do not know. I'm sorry. That's an interesting question.
Is Madison related to Thornton Johnson, one of the first professors in Georgetown College?
That would not surprise me because at some point during Johnson's chairmanship of Transylvania's board, Transylvania merged with Bacone College, and Bacone College, I think, had an affiliation as a Baptist institution, as I recall, with Georgetown, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's the case, but I don't know the answer to that.
Just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, they can drop them in the chat. I'll ask one in the meantime. Given the wartime split between Madison and his brother George over the Union and Confederacy, what evidence do we have about Madison and relationships with George's wife and children who stayed in Scott County for a long time?
It's a beautiful, beautiful story. And yet it's a beautiful story that arises from a tragedy of questionable circumstances. George Johnson's son, Madison Johnson, they called him Matty, fought with his dad in the Battle of Shiloh, and then Matty went on down to Mississippi and Vicksburg, fighting for the Confederacy. Matty, at the end of the war, was put in a Union-operated holding prison and apparently got into a dispute with some soldiers who were African American. And it ended up in him shooting and killing one of them. He claimed self-defense and was ultimately acquitted by the military tribunal that judged his case. And that would have been a military tribunal of Union soldiers. And it was at the very earliest stages of Reconstruction, so that it could have also been a racially mixed tribunal. You know, there's no way at this point to know. Nevertheless, he was freed and he remained in Mississippi and became a small farmer. He never really had much. But while he was in prison, there is a letter in the collection of the Kentucky Historical Society in the Johnson family papers from Madison to a cousin of theirs about Matty's imprisonment and how worried Johnson was. And he wanted, like any good lawyer, he wanted to know all the facts, all the details, so that perhaps he could do something about it from Lexington, given his ties to the administration. But he voiced doubt as to whether he would be able to. he maintained his ties with the family, and in his will, that branch of the family comes out equally with all the other branches. And the two portraits of Madison and Sally Ann went over to that branch of the family in Georgetown and ended up with Ms. Kaufman. And then at her death, ultimately were sold at auction.
Fantastic. And we've got one last one. I'll give it to Kathy from Farmington. Are we aware of any correspondence between Johnson and any of the Speed brothers?
I'm not aware of any. I'm sure they knew each other. He had cases in Louisville, and he frequently was over here. And although they didn't call law firms back then, mega firms with branch offices like we have now, I believe, in fact, I'm sure, that he sent any number of cases to his protege, John Mason Brown, and that Brown sent, high-level work that needed a probing, gray-haired genius back to Johnson. In his will, there are only a few specific bequests. One of them leaves money to build a home and to purchase land to people who had formerly been slaves on his property. He leaves the diamond stud to Eliza, and he leaves his entire library to John Mason Brown. Brown died, I guess 10 or 15 years after he lived in Louisville. I went to the Jefferson County Courthouse for his will, hoping in his inventory that I would find references to the books that Johnson left him, but didn't. But no, Kathy, I found no direct correspondence between Johnson and the Speed family. I'm dying to find more of his correspondence, and to date, the best collection of Johnson family correspondence is called the Kaufman Collection at the Kentucky Historical Society. It has all the family letters back and forth from Ann Viley Johnson in Georgetown to her husband, George Washington Johnson, as he was in Bowling Green, and then as he went on to the Battle of Shiloh. There are records from him on his deathbed back to his commanding general with messages for her and his family. There's a family Bible, and one of the fascinating things in the Bible is that a younger group of cousins, I guess in the 1840s, get together, and you can tell they've had quite a bender of a night and they've played cards. And they say, "I will never play cards for money again. As God is my witness." And then about 10 years later, the same cousins get together and they've done it again. And so they've apologized, and that written apology and confession is in the Bible, along with a bunch of family history.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon, and thanks so much to you, Dick.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being part of the Filson Historical Society. I want to end it with one statement. We are living in a time of national disorientation, disruption, not unlike what I remember growing up in Hopkinsville in 1968 and 69, at another very troubled time in our nation's history. The role of the Filson is so important right now to any discourse that we have in Kentucky, in Louisville, in the Ohio Valley region, because from history we learn. The same can be said about our friends at the Kentucky Historical Society. Historical institutions matter because you cannot look at history and what's going on currently. You can't look at what's going on currently without a thorough, grounded knowledge of the past. And so I encourage you to take advantage of our magnificent collection. We can answer questions for you online. We'll be open to researchers on September 1st, unless there's another shutdown. And again, thank you for being part of what I'll call the Filson family. But the extended family is people who have a love of history and a desire to learn. All of us at various stages in our lives are lifelong learners, and that matters. Thank you.